3,500 years ago, in a place called the Terebinths of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, there sat an elderly Jew in the heat of the day, recovering from, of all things, his own circumcision at the age of 99. He noticed 3 strangers, clearly thirsty and bedraggled, walking near his tent. He jumped up and ran to provide them with water and the best food he could find. He even insisted on washing their feet. His own pain, his old age, the heat of the day, could have had Abraham resting in the cool shade in the inner part of his tent with his beloved Sarah tending to him. But the first Jew didn't turn inward, either physically or metaphorically. His eyes were wide open to the blazing afternoon sun, so that he could clearly see these strangers passing by and respond to their need, even going above and beyond what would have been a perfectly adequate and even admirable act of kindness of bringing them a simple cup of water. What he, the first Jew, did shows the responsibility and the response ability, the ability to respond that echoes through the millennia. Through Torah and the universe of commentary which flows from it, we are told again and again to open our eyes, to look up as Abraham did, with our own pain and vulnerability as a catalyst for compassion toward others, rather than an excuse to close our eyes and turn inward toward ourselves and what is our own. Being aware of our vulnerability is a central value in Jewish tradition. The demand of these days of awe is to remember how deeply vulnerable we are, that our lives are fleeting, and that so much is out of our control. Abraham's painful recovery, likely slow and halting due to his old age, surely must have been a reminder of his own vulnerability and mortality. But paradoxically, as with these high holy days, the goal of being in touch with our own vulnerability is not to make us cower in fear, shaking in our powerlessness, piously surrendering to an omnipotent God and letting the chips fall where they may. In fact, an awareness of our vulnerability and the experience of our own suffering is a call to open our eyes, to empathize with others and act to ease their suffering, just as Abraham did. Ultimately, in Jewish tradition, awareness of our own vulnerability is a call to action. On Rosh Hashannah and Yom Kippur in the Unatan Tokef prayer, we ask the unanswerable. In the coming year, who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? Who after the fullness of years and who after a brief bloom? Of course we cannot answer, but the words serve as a stark reminder of our own vulnerability. We cannot control how we will die, but how we will live, this part is up to us. We are powerless, but so very powerful. It is a sense of vulnerability and powerlessness of which the High Holy Days remind us, which is meant to spur us to use our power, to use our eyes to see what needs healing in our world, to use our hands to reach out and take care of the most vulnerable in our society, even when we ourselves are in pain. To experience the days of awe in 2020 is certainly awe-inspiring. The themes of these sacred days are only deeper and more resonant for us now, perhaps more than ever in our lifetimes. For haven't these past 180 days or so been days of awe too? We've been acutely aware of our vulnerability, but also aware that our choices matter deeply. Just as on Yom Kippur, we step out of normal life by fasting and refraining from the pleasures of this world, we strip ourselves bare of the armor between ourselves and the truth of our mortality. So too, during this time of pandemic, the ordinary rhythms of our lives have been stripped away. We live in constant awareness that an invisible pathogen can strike us or our loved ones down, and we don't know, will it be mild, severe? Will we recover fully or not recover at all, or suffer long-term effects just beginning to be understood? And we have needed to step away, quite literally, from other people, distancing ourselves, retreating into our own tents, our bubbles, our pods. As we grapple with the pain of isolation and the many, many losses brought on by this pandemic, we can easily succumb to the temptation to close our eyes to the strangers walking by. It doesn't come naturally to us to tend to the needy beyond our immediate circles of concern. In fact, it's biologically ingrained in us to prioritize the survival of our own, to preserve our own genes. Empathy is the ability to reach across the boundaries that biology and human nature create in our minds and our hearts. And empathy is a muscle, very much in danger of atrophying if not exercised. So again and again, Torah pulls us outward, out of our own tents, even and perhaps especially when we have our own pain to grapple with. It's interesting that in Torah, the command, love your neighbor, is only stated once. But love the stranger, love the one who is not like you, the one who is outside of your pod, so to speak. That is stated 36 times. The most well-known articulation of this comes in the book of Exodus. You shall not oppress a ger, a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. The Torah exhorts us to use the painful experience of slavery not as an excuse to turn inward, but as an impetus for empathy. You know the feelings of the stranger, and an impetus for action. You shall not oppress the stranger. Overlapping with the months of the pandemic has been a sharpened communal awareness of racial injustice and the imperative to reach out, to speak up alongside of and behalf of those who, because of the color of their skin, are targeted in acts of violence, even and especially by those charged to protect all of us. The imperative to tend to the needs of the vulnerable and oppressed has also been sharpened into a call for communal self-reflection and teshuvah among white people. Could it be that with the stripping away of so much that we took for granted, that we are more able to see the deep systemic injustices that have been here all along, and finally to open our eyes, raise our voices, and reach out from that place in us which knows oppression? The Jewish experience of suffering over millennia, too, could easily cause us to retreat into ourselves, feeling that we've suffered so much that we don't owe anybody anything. The scholar Elaine Scarry notes that pain makes the human being turn inward. The world becomes narrowed. We lose our ability to see beyond ourselves. As the journalist Leon Wieseltier wrote, the Holocaust enlarged our Jewish hearts, and it also shrunk them. At a time when our worlds have been forcibly narrowed by the pandemic, and when our own pain, our grief, our fear, our anxiety threatens to shut our eyes and clasp our hands to those who are not like us. Perhaps they are sick and we are well for the time being. Perhaps they are poor and we are financially stable. Perhaps they are essential workers who need to be out in the world, but we can work from home. Our hearts are in danger of shrinking. But the Torah teaches that it is our own vulnerability, our own suffering, that can deeply connect us to other people who are not like us. And that ultimately connects us to God, the source of compassion and empathy. Abraham channeled his suffering in the tent into a connection with the suffering of 3 strangers. The Torah tells us to channel the memory of our suffering in Egypt into love for those who are not like us. Our vulnerability teaches us that we are all connected. And this pandemic could be understood as teaching this very same lesson. It strips away the illusion of independence, that it is even possible to care only for myself and my own, and that we can actually live in atomized, isolated bubbles. We learn this even while forced to live in ways that are more isolated and bubbled than ever before. This is the central paradox of this pandemic. That can be infected and can be a vector for infecting others. My choices to wear a mask or not wear a mask, or wash my hands or not, impact others. In fact, exponentially, far, far beyond my immediate circle of concern. In these recent weeks, massive wildfires thousands of miles away have made our skies hazy, have made residents of places so distant from the fires struggle with respiratory issues. What could be a more blatant example of the way that we are interconnected, a more powerful stripping away of our illusion of separateness? I said earlier that in responding to our own sense of vulnerability by caring for others who are not like us, we are ultimately connecting with God. Throughout Jewish sources, and deeply so in the metaphors of these high holy days, God is the origin and source of our compassion. Just before, at the beginning of the Torah service, we sang before an open ark, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet. These words come from a scene in the book of Exodus in which Moses pleads to see God face to face, to understand the great mystery. But God says, no. Moses, you cannot see me. You can't see me face to face, but I will tell you a little bit about myself. God then describes the characteristics that are our most precious inheritance as Jews and as human beings. Moses, God says, I'm full of compassion. I'm merciful. By showing Moses God's back, God is telling us, these are these qualities that I have that I've given to you, and you must manifest these qualities in my world. These words echo through hundreds of generations down to us, as the open ark reminds us to have open eyes and open hands. In the words of Victor Hugo, to love another person is to see the face of God. When we act from that godly place in us, the place of compassion and empathy, when we recognize our essential interdependence on one another, this is how we connect with God. And even beyond that, when we are able to connect in the highest and deepest way with another human being, by recognizing their need and doing what we can to respond to it, that is how we connect with God. To empathize is to recognize the face of God in the other, to respond to it, and therefore to come to know God in the only way we actually can as mortal human beings. We can't see God's face. We can't truly know and understand the great mystery, but we can know what is godly, and we can manifest it in this world by acting with compassion and empathy. Like El Rachum v'Chanun, Rav Chesed, the merciful one who is full of compassion. As we continue to journey through this pandemic, things that we once depended on to be open, our schools, our synagogues, our businesses, will be closed. We will continue to be asked to physically distance ourselves from those outside of our metaphorical tents. How will we answer the call of our sacred heritage to find new ways to reach out, to sit at the entrance of our tents, with eyes open to the blazing heat, and even as we blink against the uncomfortable brightness, to pay attention to the strangers walking by, and even in our own pain and suffering, to extend our abundant kindness and compassion. Shana Tova, may it be a good year, rooted in empathy, openness, and justice for all.